Alrighty then, start na tayo. Most people see what's on the surface, but beneath it, there's always more. Hello everyone, and welcome to my first ever video on my second channel, REDRUMREN Plus. I already have trouble keeping up with my first channel, but Now there are plenty of channels that covers mysteries, histories, and urban legends, so why make another one? Well, because this one is finally mine. And honestly, I can't think of a better way to kick things off than with the first video being the topic that sparked this entire separate channel in the first place. And that is the Philippines, its myths, and its urban legends. Today, we're diving into something that I think is genuinely underrated, and at face value, these stories might sound like nothing more than campfire tales or old superstitions, but once you start looking a little deeper, you begin to notice a fascinating juxtaposition of folklore, rumors, and fears that have quietly shaped generations of Filipinos. And that is the topic of this video. This video is going to be divided into different tiers, and this format is referred to as an iceberg diagram. And as you can see here, some entries are incredibly well known, others are obscure, some are genuinely unsettling, and a few are so bizarre that you can't help but wonder how they became part of Filipino culture in the first place. Over the course of this series, we're going to explore all of them, but before we begin though, there's one important caveat to this, because we are gonna have risky topics about the Philippines in this video. Now, this video isn't meant to mock or insult the Philippines, quite the opposite. You see, the Philippines is a country with incredibly rich culture, resilient communities, and stories that, unlike anywhere else in the world, but like every nation, however, it has its myths, it has its tragedies, it has its stories, misconceptions, and admittedly some ridiculous internet memes. So that's what we're exploring today. These stories don't define the country, they simply tell us something about the people who told them. So take it with a grain of salt. So with that being said, thank you for watching, and let's start.
Tulad mo baliling ay isang mutya.
The Nut Shack. If you've never heard of it, congratulations, you didn't really miss much. You see, The Nut Shack was a Filipino-American animated sitcom that aired on television between 2007 and 2011. And watching the show isn't really disturbing because it's scary, it's disturbing because it's genuinely bad. But it didn't make it in this list because it's bad. It made it in the list because of its humor. Just watch.
It's me, fill your cup!
Hey, what the f*** are you staring with your peephole, you filthy Filipinos?
You Chuck!
A huge portion of the comedy is built around the exaggerated accent, racial stereotypes, and art styles that were supposedly meant to represent different ethnic groups, especially Filipinos. But instead of feeling satirical or clever, however, most of the jokes come across as painfully forced and at times outright insulting. Because the series leaned so heavily into stereotypes that you start wondering whether it actually wants to make a joke land in the first place. Because rather than building clever punchlines, it often mistakes being loud for being funny. And judging by the reaction online when I researched this, a lot of people didn't like it, and over time, The Nut Shack developed a reputation as one of the worst animated shows ever made. And it's not in a fun, oh haha, it's so bad, it's good kind of way. It's like, this is shit. And oddly enough, that's a pattern we're going to see more throughout this video. War on Drugs. The Philippine War on Drugs, or the Guerra contra Droga, is a government-led campaign that was launched on July 1, 2016 under former President Rodrigo Duterte. And depending on who you ask, it was either remembered as a necessary crackdown on crime here in the Philippines or one of the most controversial campaigns in modern Philippine history. Its objective was relatively straightforward, it's easy to understand. Basically, the Guerra contra Droga was created to reduce illegal drugs, dismantle criminal syndicates, and therefore lower crime across the country. And to be fair, there were people that believed it achieved exactly that because in some areas reported crimes actually did decline, especially those with drug-related incidents. But there's an important part to this conversation, the other part. Those results came at an enormous cost because according to official figures and independent investigations, thousands upon thousands of people lost their lives during this campaign. Now, please understand the exact number remains heavily disputed. For example, when I researched this, one major news program says that the people who died in this drug campaign was 6,252, but United Nations themselves said it was in the 8,000 number. All of these are rough estimations, of course, but that's precisely how much of the conversation lies, because many of the deaths weren't simply documented to have that exact number, because some cases are unresolved, some are not yet solved, and some are still investigated to this day. Just understand that when it happened, many families woke up one day to discover that someone they loved was gone. Entire communities found themselves living in a strange paradox. Firstly, they feared crime, but they also feared the very people tasked with stopping it. But please understand this, I also need to present the other side fairly, because many Duterte supporters argued that his administration brought greater order to parts of the country. They point out to infrastructure projects, government reforms, and improvements in public services. But nevertheless, one question continues to linger, because how far is too far? Because when a system is designed to protect its citizen becomes something those same citizens begin to fear, the conversation is no longer about security. It becomes a debate about power. And unlike most entries in this video, this isn't folklore, this isn't even a ghost story, it's part of history. And even today, many people continue to debate what it meant, what it achieved, and what it ultimately costs. Typhoon Yolanda. This is one of those entries in the video where words almost fail to capture the scale of what happened. Typhoon Haiyan, or better known in the Philippines as Typhoon Yolanda, made landfall here in the Philippines on November 8, 2013. And when people say it was powerful, this isn't an exaggeration. This is because it remains one of the most strongest tropical cyclones ever recorded in the whole world. On November 8 at around 4 a.m., Yolanda tore across the central Philippines in less than 18 hours, making 6 landfalls along the way. It first struck Giwan, eastern Samar, at peak intensity, with sustained winds reaching around 315 kilometers per hour. And from there, it swept to Leyte, where Tacloban City suffered catastrophic storm surges, before crossing to northern Cebu, Panay Island, and finally Palawan, where eventually exiting into the West Philippine Sea. Now, the official death toll exceeded 6,000 people, although many researchers believe that the real number may be significantly higher, as countless victims were never recovered. And in fact, as recent as 2017, remains believed to belong to a Yolanda victim has been discovered. This was discovered in Barangay Bagakay, Tacloban City, a full 4 years since the typhoon. Karaoke invention. Now, you've probably heard this before, where someone would say, "Oh, a Filipino invented karaoke," or "Oh, Rosario invented the karaoke machine," which is a Filipino. And honestly, it sounds believable because, after all, Filipino culture has a deep connection with music. Because almost everywhere you go, people are singing. This includes birthdays, weddings, baptisms, funerals, or even on completely ordinary nights when someone just suddenly grabs a microphone. For many Filipinos, singing is simply part of everyday life. So it's easy to believe that the karaoke machine, or at least the concept of karaoke, originated in the Philippines. But like many stories in this video, the truth is a little more complicated. Firstly, the first karaoke machine and also its concept was not invented in the Philippines. It was created in Japan in the early 1970s by a musician named Daisuke Inui. So where did the Filipino inventor story come from? Well, here's the answer. In 1975, a Filipino inventor named Roberto del Rosario filed a patent for his own version of a karaoke machine. He called it the sing-along system. And if you're not familiar with what a patent is, it's actually pretty simple because when you have a patent for something you invented, once you register a patent, other companies can't simply copy your exact design or system without your permission. It's basically your way of saying, oh, I created this, so I only have the legal right to make it and sell it for a certain period of time. The sing-along system combined several important components that make it the karaoke machine. Firstly, a cassette player that used instrumental -1 tracks. And if you're wondering what -1 means, it's very simple. It's simply a version of the song with the lead vocals removed so that you can sing them for yourself. Next on the sing-along system was a microphone input, a speaker, and an amplifier, and lastly, the voice effects such as echo and reverb. And in many ways, it was one of the earliest complete home karaoke systems that ordinary families could use. Because of this, many people began referring to Roberto del Rosario as the inventor of karaoke, and that's where the legend began. So even if Filipinos didn't invent karaoke first, we were among the people who helped give it its identity now. Maria Labo. Maria Labo is one of the most infamous urban legends in the Philippines, particularly in the Visayas, and at face value, it sounds like another over-the-top horror story until you look at what it might actually represent. Over the years, the legend has inspired movies, television episodes, and countless retellings, but this is the version most people are familiar with. Maria was a mother who left her family behind to work overseas as an OFW. You see, countless parents leave home in the Philippines in the hopes of giving their families a better life in the future. And while working abroad, Maria found employment under a wealthy household. But something wasn't right because depending on this version of the story, her employer was either a vampire, a cannibal, or something far more sinister. Because without realizing it, Maria was supposedly fed human flesh, more specifically the human liver. And little by little, something inside her began to change. Not physically, of course, but mentally. And when she eventually returned home in the Philippines, one night her husband, who was a police officer, asked a simple question. He asked Maria, "Maria, where is our child?" Maria calmly replied, "Oh, he's already at the table." If you already know the story, you know why I made that face. But for those who don't know, this is what happened. Because when her husband uncovered the meal, their child was lying there, dead. Maria had unknowingly cooked her own son. Horrified by what the police officer saw, he slashed her across the face, leaving a permanent scar. And according to the story, that's where the name Maria Labo came from. It is derived from the Hiligaynon word labo, meaning slashed or cut. But again, looking for the interpretation of this legend, I don't think it's really about the monster that Maria became. It was about fear. The fear of leaving your family behind, the fear of exploitation, the fear of loneliness, and perhaps the most unsettling fear of all, returning home as someone your loved ones no longer recognize. Because in that sense, Maria Labo isn't just a story, a horror story. It's an allegory wrapped in horror. Because sometimes those are the stories that stayed with us the longest. Why pineapples have eyes? The legend of the pineapple or the alamat ng pinya is a well-known Filipino folk tale about a girl named Pina. Some books also call her Pinya or Pinang, but I'm gonna call her Pinang since that was the name I'm familiar with as a child. And at first glance, the legend of the pineapple feels like a typical moral story, a hardworking mother, a lazy child, and a lesson about responsibility. But the way that the lesson is delivered, it's intense. Basically, this is what happened. Pinang lived with her hardworking mother, Aling Rosa. Her mother constantly asked her to help with the chores, especially cooking, but Pinang was lazy and always complained and procrastinated. Whenever her mother asked her to find something, Pinang would say, I can find it, I can find it. One day, Aling Rosa got sick and needed Pinang to cook for them. And as usual, Pinang struggled, procrastinated, and kept saying she couldn't see the things she needed. Frustrated, weak, and sick, her mother shouted in anger, I wish you had 1,000 eyes so you could find what you were looking for. And then, when she did that, Pinang disappears. No dramatic transformation scene, no magical build-up, no 1997 Steven Spielberg, just gone. Days pass, then weeks. The mother searches everywhere, of course, slowly realizing what she might have done. And eventually, she finds a strange plant growing below her house. And that plant had a fruit. A fruit that was covered in ice. A fruit covered in ice. And that's the moment where it clicks. Because that's her daughter. Oh. When she finds out that that was her daughter, she wailed, she cried, clutching her daughter, shouting, "Why did you turn into a fruit?" And that fruit becomes what we know now as the pineapple. The legend of the pineapple is a reflection on cultural values here in the Philippines, specifically discipline, responsibility, and the fear of becoming a burden. So, but still though, you turned into a fruit because you couldn't cook rice. Manila City Hall shape. This next one isn't really an urban legend, it's more of a visual rumor, but somehow it's managed to stick around for decades. If you've ever looked at Manila City Hall from above, maybe on Google Maps, you've probably noticed something unusual. It kind of looks like a coffin, and once you see it, you can't really unsee it. Now at face value, it sounds like the kind of conspiracy the internet would invent out of boredom. Like I read somewhere that the shape of Manila City Hall was like that because it was meant because it was meant to look like a Templar shield. Others claim it was because of the Philippines' religious devotion to God, and that's why there's a coffin shaped like a building with a cross in the middle, but that doesn't make sense. But still, the reality, however, is far less mysterious. The architect of Manila City Hall is the prominent Filipino neoclassical artist Antonio Toledo. Originally, it was conceived in an Art Deco style by Juan Arellano, but the project was turned over to Toledo, who redesigned the building in the neoclassical style. And that structure, that building, was completed in 1941. Because when you look at the layout of the building, something might catch your eye. And that is the roads. I think that the building wasn't designed to look like the shape of a coffin. It just looked like that because that's the only space they had because of the roads. That means, if the roads looked different, then the building could have looked different. So that means if the roads weren't shaped like a coffin, then the building wouldn't have been shaped like a coffin. Bahay na Pula. This next one is very difficult to talk about, and honestly, I'm going to keep it relatively short with this one because unlike the many entries on this video, the horror here isn't folklore. It is actually history. The Bahay na Pula, which literally translates to the Red House, is located in Bulacan, and at first glance, it looks like an ordinary abandoned house. It's the kind of place you'd probably drive past without thinking twice, but during World War II, it became the setting for one of the darkest chapters in Philippine history. You see, during the Japanese occupation in the Philippines between 1942 to 1945, the house was reportedly used as a site of imprisonment and abuse. And yes, when I mean abuse, I mean that kind of abuse. Because one of the most disturbing aspects was the age of some of the victims. Many were just children, as far as 8 years old to 12 years old. And it's no surprise many years later the house became surrounded by stories of apparitions, shadowy figures, unexplained voices, and an overwhelming sense of dread. And whether or not those paranormal claims are true is another question. But personally, I'm saying this now because a lot of the content creators here in YouTube use Bahay na Pula as a area to do ghost hunting. But personally, I don't think Bahay na Pula needs ghosts to be terrifying because its history is already more haunting than anything the supernatural could ever add. Because people did die, because children did die, and some of those children were abused. Deng Baksha, the next entry is a different kind of fear. It isn't about ghosts, it isn't about urban legends. It is something that affected hundreds and thousands of Filipino families here in the Philippines. Dengvaxia was actually the world's first dengue vaccine, and on December 22, 2015, the Philippine government approved its commercial release here in the Philippines, making the Philippines the first country in Asia to authorize its use. And just a few months later, on April 4, 2016, the Department of Health, or the DOH, launched a nationwide immunization program administering the vaccine primarily to public school children in an effort to reduce the country's growing burden of dengue. At first glance, it seemed like a monumental breakthrough because, after all, dengue had plagued the Philippines for decades, infecting hundreds of thousands of people and claiming thousands of lives. And this arrival of the world's first dengue vaccine felt like a turning point, a medical breakthrough that could finally help control one of the country's most persistent diseases. But then, everything changed. The company that made the vaccine announced that Dengvaxia could actually increase the risk of severe dengue in people who had never been infected with the virus before receiving the vaccine. And that's when things became incredibly complicated because more than 800,000 children had already received at least one dose here in the Philippines. Of course, parents began asking the question, had they unknowingly put their children at risk? And as the story gained national attention, public concern quickly turned into panic because news outlets covered it extensively. And of course, political debates soon followed. And well, politicians did what politicians usually do best. They pointed fingers. But nevertheless, the lasting implication went far beyond politics because public confidence in vaccines here in the Philippines began to collapse, not just for Dengvaxia, but actually for routine childhood vaccinations as well. And because of that, consequently, immunization rates declined, and in the years that followed, the Philippines experienced major measles outbreaks, with many public health experts pointing to the vaccine hesitancy as one of the contributing factors. But one thing that is difficult to argue against is the controversy fundamentally changed how many Filipinos viewed vaccines, especially public health, and the institutions meant to protect them. Instant noodle wax. Okay, this one might sound a little ridiculous at first, but if you grew up in the Philippines like me, you probably heard it before. The claim was simple. It's that instant noodles are coated in wax, and that wax supposedly builds up inside your body, sticking into your intestines and eventually causing serious health problems. Some versions even claimed that it could cause cancer, and the solution to this was to boil the noodle once, drain the water, boil it again, maybe even a third time, just to be safe. Scientifically though, there's no credible evidence to support any of this because the so-called waxy coating isn't wax in the way most people imagine it. It's simply part of the manufacturing process, and it doesn't simply accumulate in your body the way the myth claims. So why did many people believe it? I think what's interesting about this is the rumor wasn't really about the noodles itself. It was about uncertainty. You see, instant noodles were cheap. It was highly processed, and for most people, they had absolutely no idea how they were made. And that uncertainty created a perfect environment for rumors to spread. Consequently, because of that, the story became pervasive. Parents warned their children, friends repeated it to one another, chain text messages claimed it was true, then Facebook came along and somehow that rumor became even bigger. And whether or not people genuinely believed it is another question, but a lot of us still remember draining the first pot of water, just in case. Slippers left at night. This one almost feels harmless until you remember what it was like being a kid. Now, the rule was simple. Don't leave your slippers outside at night, because if you do, someone or something might come for you. And depending on who told the story, it was either a cult, a group of Satanists, or just some mysterious bad people that chooses their next victim based on slippers. That somehow, if they were left outside, you were next. And as a kid, that was more than enough. You didn't ask questions, you didn't look for evidence, you just made sure your slippers were safely inside before the sun went down, because the alternative wasn't worth finding out. Now, my experience with this one is actually pretty funny, and by the way, this isn't part of the script, but one morning, me and my brother went outside because we wanted to pee. So we went to the door and got our slippers, and my brother, when he got his slippers, someone had actually spit in his slippers. So of course, my brother cried, not really cried, he just got angry, and my aunt rushed out and asked why he was angry. My brother said, "May nagtupla sa tsinelas ko." So yeah. So yeah. Maybe the legend was true after all. Evil people. Evil people. Headless priests. Now we're stepping into something that feels much closer to traditional Filipino horror. Finally. If you grew up in the Philippines, chances are you've already heard this story at least once. It is a ghost of a priest without a head, slowly wandering through the darkness. Sometimes he's standing completely still, sometimes he's walking, and sometimes he's simply watching. Well, not watching because you need the head first, but the rule is always the same. If you see him, something bad is about to happen to you. A bad omen, if you will. Now, like many Filipino ghost stories, there are people who believe that this legend has historical roots. Like during World War II, members of the clergy were persecuted and in some cases brutally executed. Others draw parallels to the execution of the Gomburza, whose deaths became one of the most defining moments in Filipino history. And whether those events directly inspired the legend is difficult to say, but it's certainly an interesting interpretation, because that's how often folklore develops. Real history gradually becomes intertwined with collective memory until the line between fact and legends start to blur. Teacher's Camp. Teacher's Camp is a real place. It is located in Baguio and was originally built during the American colonial period as a training center for educators or teachers. And on paper, there's nothing unusual about it, just a place where teachers stay, attend seminars, and develop their skills. But the land it sits on is where things become a little more complicated. Because long before the camp existed, the area was inhabited by indigenous Igorot communities who had lived in the mountains for generations, preserving much of their culture and traditions. But when World War II came around, according to various historical accounts, the site was reportedly used by Japanese forces, possibly as a holding area for prisoners. And whether every detail is historically documented or what is still debated, but nevertheless, when a place accumulates that much history, stories inevitably follow. Visitors, staff, and even teachers have reported seeing a woman in white wandering through the grounds after dark. Other claims that they've encountered the headless priest that we've just talked about earlier, silently standing near some of their older buildings. And according to local folklore, especially there in Teacher's Camp, the spirits of the Igorots are also said to appear around the camp, supposedly because they were killed there many years ago. Some people claim they've woken up to find a smiling Igorot ghost staring back at them, although personally that doesn't sound all that terrifying because who knows, maybe he's just happy to have some company. But the story that caught my attention the most during my research for this one was something called the lovesick Igorot. According to the legend, this spirit becomes attached to women staying at the camp. Of course, not violently or aggressively, it just simply follows them, watching, sometimes even appearing inside the rooms while they sleep. And I think that makes it so much more unsettling because it's not the idea of being attacked, it's the idea that something is quietly observing you and there's nothing you can do about it. Now, whether any of these stories are true is another question, but Teacher's Camp itself is very real. Davao Freak Snow. This next one isn't really a horror story, it's more of a modern mystery, because over the years, vague and scattered reports have surfaced online claiming that it once snowed in Davao City. Now, if you're from the Philippines, this immediately raises a red flag, because the Philippines is a tropical country which has tropical climate, so that means snow doesn't simply happen here. So with that answer, what did the people actually see in Davao City? Well, most likely what they saw wasn't snow, but of course, hail. Hail consists of balls or lumps of ice that form inside powerful thunderstorms. Basically, it forms when strong winds carry raindrops high into the atmosphere where temperatures are well below freezing. And as those frozen droplets are filled with layers and layers of ice, it eventually becomes too heavy and it will start falling to the ground. And if you've ever seen snow before, it's easy to mistake one for the other. And at first glance, that seems to explain everything. That it was a unnatural occurrence but still natural in nature. But here's where things get interesting because they describe it as the ground turning completely white because of the snow. Other claims that the storm lasted longer than it should have, or that the atmosphere felt strangely quiet, almost unnatural. Now, whether those details were exaggerated over time is not known, but memory has a funny way of reshaping unusual events, especially when people begin telling the same story. But scientifically, though, there's nothing paranormal about hail. It's rare in the Philippines, but it does happen under the right conditions. Lizares Mansion. The Lizares Mansion is located in Talisay, Negros Occidental, and carries a different kind of atmosphere. More commonly known today as the ruins, the Lizares Mansion is one of the most recognizable landmarks in the Philippines. It was built in the early 1900s by sugar baron Don Mariano Ledesma Lacson, and that building or that house was a tribute to his wife, Maria Braga Lacson, a Portuguese woman who tragically died during pregnancy. And deeply devastated by her death, Lacson commissioned the mansion in her memory, earning it the nickname the Taj Mahal of Negros. And at first glance, it's easy to see why people are drawn to it. Even in ruins, the mansion is beautiful, but beauty and tragedy often exist side by side because during World War II, Filipino guerrillas deliberately set the mansion on fire to prevent Japanese forces from using it as a military headquarters. Reportedly, the blaze burned for several days, leaving behind the skeletal structure that still stands today. And perhaps that's where the paranormal narrative begins, because over the years, visitors, staff, and security guards have reported hearing footsteps echo throughout empty corridors, whispers with no obvious source, and seeing shadowy figures moving between the old columns. And the most persistent story, however, centers around Maha Braga herself, the wife of Lacson. Some visitors claim that they've seen a woman in white frequently standing among the ruins, and whether those sightings are genuine or not, who knows? But nevertheless, I think that's exactly what makes the ruins so captivating. UP hauntings. The University of the Philippines Diliman, or the UP Diliman, is known as the country's premier state university. It is built on research, science, and critical thinking, which is precisely what makes the story surrounding it so unique. Because despite being one of the most academically well-known institutions in the country, ghost stories have always been part of its campus life. Ask enough students, professors, security guards, staff, and eventually someone will have a story. Maybe it's Palma Hall, where footsteps are reportedly heard echoing through empty corridors long after classes have ended. Maybe it's the classroom doors opening on their own, or catching glimpses of shadow figures that disappear the moment you directly look at them. And the most well-known one that I've read is the UP Theater, because some claim they've heard faint applause or music coming from the inside, despite the building being completely empty. Joggers have even spoken about the uneasy feeling that someone is following them, only to turn around and find no one is there. But it's also worth mentioning that a lot of people don't know this, but Balete Drive just sits beyond the university. And we all know the story of Balete Drive, right? Given its association with the famous White Lady legend, it's perhaps inevitable that some of those stories would eventually find their way onto the UP campus. And whether that's coincidence or simply the way urban legends evolve, depends on your interpretation. But again, I'm not from UP Diliman, so weh. White Lady. Now, this is probably the most iconic horror story here in this video, because if you ever heard a ghost story that originated in the Philippines, it's this, the White Lady, specifically the one on Balete Drive in Quezon City. And the most common story goes like this. One night, a taxi driver is driving late at night. The roads are empty, it's quiet, not a person in sight. Then suddenly, at the corner of his eye, a woman appears. Long black hair, white dress, and pale skin. And that woman asks for a ride. And of course, nothing seems wrong at first. She just sits in the back seat, doesn't say much. But when the driver looks at the rear view mirror and sees her face, the woman's face is no longer the same. This time, the woman's face is bruised, bloodied, and not right. But when he turns around, she's gone. No door opening, no sound, just gone. Now, there are many variations of this story, and the story that I've just given to you is the most well known. And because of that, it's kind of hard to pin down a single origin of where this story may have originated from. People say that she died in a car accident, others say she was a victim of something worse, and some even believe that the story was fabricated decades ago. But really, that doesn't really matter because people still report seeing her. And even now, what makes this one specifically effective, this horror story, is how ordinary it feels. It's not a haunted house, it is not a cursed object, it's a person. Because of the legend's popularity, of course, it has inspired countless films and television programs over the years. From classic horror movies to modern films and television specials, the image of the White Lady has been repeatedly used as a symbol of fear and the supernatural. Schools built on graveyards. If you ever went to school in the Philippines, there's a pretty good chance you've heard this one before. At some point, someone probably told you, a friend, a classmate perhaps, that your school is haunted and that your school was built on a cemetery. And for some reason, every school seemed to have that rumor, and that somehow every batch of students knew someone who knew someone who knew someone that the old building used to be a cemetery. And at first glance, it sounds like nothing more than just another urban legend. But the interesting thing about all of this is that these experiences are actually pieces of history that help explain why this belief has endured. You see, as cities grow or as an area grows, land gets reused. Old cemeteries get relocated, battlegrounds disappear beneath new developments, and in countries like Philippines where wars, colonialism, and rapid urbanization shape the landscape, it's not impossible for schools to occupy land with a complicated past. But it's worth mentioning that there are historical examples often connected to this discussion. For example, the University of Santo Tomas served as an internment camp during World War II, where many prisoners lost their lives inside the campus. Although it wasn't originally built as a cemetery, tragic events did happen there. But let's circle back. Does every school rumored to be built on a graveyard is true? Probably not, but nevertheless, the rumor continues to spread from one generation of students to the next. Tabi-tabi po. Some Filipino superstitions disappear over time. Others become so deeply ingrained that we stop questioning them altogether. Tabi-tabi po is one of those phrases. For many Filipinos, saying it has become second nature. As you're about to step into a patch of tall grass, as you walk past an old balete tree or any old tree, or relieve yourself somewhere in the middle of nowhere, instinctively we all say, tabi-tabi po. Literally, it means excuse me or please move aside. And we do this because according to Filipino folklore, those words aren't meant for people. They're meant for the unseen. They're meant for the ghosts. The belief is that certain places are inhabited by spirits or supernatural beings such as ghosts, duendes, kapres, nono sa punso, or other entities that might be invisible to the human eye. So by asking permission before entering their space, you're acknowledging their presence and hopefully avoiding their wrath. Because if you don't say that, folklore says that you could become mysteriously ill, lose your way in the forest, or suffer an unexplained curse. And of course, there's no scientific evidence that simply forgetting to say tabi-tabi po causes any of those things, but I don't think that's why the tradition has survived. I think it's because it's quietly teaching respect. Respect for nature, respect for places you don't fully understand, and sometimes respect for the possibility that not everything needs an explanation. So the next time you hear someone whisper, tabi-tabi po, maybe they're speaking to spirits or maybe they're continuing a tradition that has been passed down for generations. Because either way, those three simple words have become one of the most enduring pieces of Filipino culture. Kambal na Cruz. This next one is a little bit different because it's not about horror, it's about faith. In 1922, a man named Crispino Lacandoso was cutting wood from an old tamarind tree in Manila, and according to the story, as he split the trunk open, he saw two markings, and upon closer inspection, both of them were in the shape of a cross. Now, depending on your perspective, that discovery could simply be a coincidence, because wood naturally forms knots, cracks, or grain patterns that our brains often interpret as familiar shapes. It's a phenomenon called pareidolia, which is our tendency to recognize meaningful images in otherwise random patterns. For example, seeing faces in clouds, animals in rock formations, or shapes where none were intentionally created. But for the people who witnessed this discovery in 1922, when they saw the cross, that wasn't what they saw, that wasn't what they believed. Because to them, those markings weren't random, they were a sign. It was a manifestation of the Christian faith. News of the discovery spread quickly throughout Manila, and people traveled from different places just to witness the twin crosses or Kambal na Cruz for themselves. And eventually, the pieces of wood that were discovered were preserved inside a glass case, and a small chapel was built around them. And over the years, what began as a curious discovery gradually became a place of pilgrimage. And even today, visitors continue to travel the Chapel of the Twin Crosses or the Chapel of Kambal na Cruz to pray, to reflect, or to simply seek guidance during their most difficult moments in life. Right now, there are religious processions, gatherings, and local traditions that have continued to grow around something that, at its core, began with a simple piece of wood. And whether those crosses were truly miraculous is ultimately a matter of personal belief. History can't answer that question, science can't answer it either, faith works that way. And I think that's what makes the story of the twin crosses so amazing. Pare, pulis ako. This one is a little unusual because it's not about a ghost, it's not about a monster either, it's just a simple sentence, pare, pulis ako, or bro, I'm a police. And as ordinary as it sounds, it earned itself as a chilling reputation in Filipino urban legends. Because in most versions of the story, those words aren't meant to make you feel safe. They're meant to lower your guard. Because they make you trust someone you don't actually know. The story always begins at midnight, on a quiet road, or a place where almost no one is around. A stranger approaches you, calm and relaxed, and then he looks at you and says, "Pare, pulis ako." And sometimes, he flashes what appears to be a badge, and other times he simply doesn't even need one because of the way he speaks, the way he carries himself is enough to convince people that he's a police. And because we're taught to trust authority figures, many people hesitate to question him. And that's where the tension comes from. Because what if he's lying? Because in many versions of the story, it was actually a criminal posing as a police officer to rob you, to kill you, or to deceive you into giving your things. At its core, this isn't really about a story of theft, it is about a story of trust. Authority is supposed to make us feel safe, but when you can no longer be certain that the authority is genuine, it becomes vulnerability. Whether the story behind it is true or not, pare, pulis ako, has become one of the most recognizable horror motifs in modern Filipino urban legends. Aswang auditory tricks. When people talk about the aswang, the image that usually comes to mind is a monster lurking in the darkness. But in many Filipino legends, the aswang's greatest weapon isn't its strength, its speed, or its appearance. Its greatest weapon is its deception. Because one of the most famous abilities attributed to the aswang is its use of sound to confuse and mislead its victims. You've probably heard this one before, the tick, tick, or wak, wak sound before. Those are attributed to the aswangs. These sounds have become some of the most recognizable parts of aswang folklore. And what makes this legend particularly interesting is the strange way this sound is said to work. According to the belief, if the tick-tick sound is loud, then the creature is still far away. But if the sound becomes faint or it seems to be moving farther away, the aswang is already closer to you. In other words, it is the opposite. The very thing that is supposed to warn you that the aswang is close to you becomes the form of deception. And that's what makes this idea so unsettling, because you don't know where to look, you don't know how far the threat really is, and you don't know whether or not you're still safe. Because really, when your sense of direction depends mostly on what you hear, it is much easier to misjudge where a sound is coming from. And from a scientific point of view or scientific perspective, there are several possible explanations for this one. Sound can be affected by wind, temperature, distance, or obstacles in the environment, and human perception also changes in darkness. But regardless of that explanation, the legend continues to endure. Because if you can't trust your own hearing, what can you trust? Sixpence Tumblr post. This is a controversy that is very well known in the internet. The controversy began when Sixpence, a Tumblr user, revealed that her family in Bangladesh had a young live-in domestic worker employed in their household. According to her, child labor was considered normal in that environment. And at first glance, the post feels offensive because it's casually brushing off child labor by saying, oh, that's the custom, but it comes across as dismissive. Sixpence phrased it as if the issue isn't as serious but simply part of everyday life somewhere else. And even though that she says she wishes it didn't happen, the overall tone leans more toward justification than concern. And it also misinterprets exploitation as a fair exchange. By Sixpence saying that, oh, that's what they do here, or saying, oh, this is normal, the speaker separates themselves from the issue and implies that different standards apply depending on where people live. And that mindset can be harmful because it suggests that some groups are simply expected to tolerate conditions others wouldn't normally accept. And overall, this backlash wasn't caused by one sentence alone. It came from a combination of dismissiveness, stereotyping, and the normalization of harm throughout the post. Hanging coffins. This one is real, and if you've ever seen pictures of it, you know how surreal it looks. This mountain is located in Sagada, where coffins are literally hung on cliffs. Not buried, not placed underground, hung. And at first it seems strange, maybe even unsettling, but once you understand the reasoning behind it, it becomes something else entirely. You see, for the Igorot people, placing the dead higher up brings them closer to the spiritual world. But there's also practical reasons why they do this, because firstly, the mountainous terrain offers very little flat land, so burying the dead wasn't always ideal. And hanging coffins also help preserve space and protected the bodies from animals and rapid decomposition. But still, there's something surreal about seeing them. Rows and rows of coffins suspended against rock walls, but it's just their form of belief. And now we end on something that isn't supernatural at all, but it might be the most realistic thing in this entire video. Crab mentality. The idea is simple. When crabs are placed in a bucket, any crab that tries to climb out gets pulled back down by the others, so none of them escape. And at some point, people realize that people do this too. In the Philippines, this idea often comes up whenever someone succeeds. You see, instead of celebrating them, sometimes there's this urge to tear down that success. You might hear them say, oh, they're only successful because they're rich. Oh, they just got lucky. Oh, mayaman ang parents niyan. Instead of lifting people up, we pull them back down, just like the crabs in the bucket. And that unsettling part is how ordinary it feels. You hear it in jokes, you hear it in casual conversations, even within the family. Not always out of malice, of course, but sometimes it's just the insecurities coming out. Sometimes it's just a comparison, sometimes it's simply habit. And over time, it creates a culture where success feels like something you have to defend instead of something worth celebrating. And what makes this the perfect ending to this first tier video of mine is that it brings everything back to reality. Now, there's no ghosts, no monsters, no myths, just people being monsters. And with that, that's where we'll end today's video. Part 2 is coming soon. So if you've made it this far, thank you so much for watching. I just wanted to share a little background about me and this second channel of mine because, well, this is my first video. Firstly, I wanted to make these types of videos for a long time. Videos about mysteries, history, strange stories, basically topics that make us look at the world a little bit differently. And honestly, I've really enjoyed making this one. Well, at least the first part of making this one, I still have to edit it. But I'm really happy with how this first recording is taking place. Is that the right English? Nabudlayan man ko kay Ilonggo ko. I'm not going to pretend that it's perfect. I still have a lot to learn when it comes to writing, editing, recording, and for making better documentaries. But every project starts somewhere, and for me, this is the starting point. Anyway, as for part 2 of this video, or tier 2, don't worry, I'm already finished working on it. Just needs a few grammar checks and I'll be done. And in fact, after this one, I'm gonna edit it. Please understand that one thing I've learned while making this video is that documentaries are very hard to make. And another problem for me is the English language because my tongue hurts when I speak too much English. I don't know if that's a problem for other people, but still. Documentaries are a completely different beast. There's research, script writing, narration, recording for the narration, finding the right footage, and somehow putting it all together into a video that actually makes sense. So yeah, it's very hard to create videos. Thank you for being patient with this one, and if you've reached this part of the video, thank you for watching this. Seriously, something as simple as watching this video, clicking on the like button or subscribing means more than you probably realize. So if you want to, please subscribe, please like, or please share it with your friends. Anyway, sorry, that was a bit of a tangent. Anyway, thank you for watching. Take care of yourselves and stay safe. Look after your health. Oh god, that sounded corny. Ooh. Anyway, there's a headless priest behind you holding a pineapple saying, "Do you want to do karaoke?" Anyway, oh god, nahalo ko na eh. Anyway, thank you for watching and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!